September 1944, Western Europe. The Allied advance has stalled, not because of German armor, not because of Hitler's counterattacks, but because of stone. For 1,600 years, the city of Metz had never fallen by frontal assault. Romans held it, medieval kings reinforced it, Prussia transformed it into one of the most advanced fortress systems in Europe. And now, 50,000 German troops, protected by concrete forts, underground tunnels, and interlocking artillery, waited behind its walls. Most Allied commanders believed Metz should be bypassed. One man refused. General George S. Patton Jr. turned his Third Army toward the fortress everyone said could not be taken. What followed was a grinding, controversial siege that split historians and forced even Winston Churchill to reconsider what impregnable really meant. By November, Metz would fall. And when it did, Churchill said something few expected. But to understand why, we have to start where Patton himself began, with a warning the Allies ignored.
Metz was not just a city, it was a system. By 1944, the Germans controlled fortifications originally designed by the French and expanded by the Kaiser's engineers after 1871. The Metz complex included over 40 major forts, many buried deep underground, linked by tunnels immune to conventional artillery. Each fort could fight independently. Each had overlapping fields of fire, and each was stocked for months of resistance. To military planners, Metz represented a nightmare scenario, a fortress guarding the Moselle River approaches to Germany itself. Leaving it in the rear risked counterattacks, artillery fire on supply lines, and a threat to the entire Allied southern flank. Yet Patton had warned against this kind of thinking years earlier. "Fixed fortifications are a monument to the stupidity of man," he once said. Now, history was daring him to prove it.
Patton reached Metz under terrible circumstances. By early September 1944, the Third Army was starved of fuel. Eisenhower had shifted priority north, supporting Montgomery's push toward Operation Market Garden. Patton's tanks sat idle. His momentum vanished. This delay proved fatal to any hope of bypassing Metz. German forces flooded into the fortress during the pause. Infantry divisions, Volksgrenadiers, and fortress troops reinforced the forts, while Allied aircraft struggled against weather and distance. Critics later asked the question that still divides historians. Should Patton have bypassed Metz entirely, encircled it, and raced for the Rhine? But Patton understood something others underestimated. Metz was not an island. Its guns could reach Allied supply routes. Its garrison could strike from the rear. Leaving it alive was a gamble he refused to take.
Patton's first mistake came at Fort Driant. In September 1944, U.S. infantry assaulted the fort, believing it could be seized quickly. It could not. The Germans fought from underground levels, immune to bombing. Flamethrowers failed. Explosives barely scratched the structure. Casualties mounted. Progress vanished. The assault became exactly what Patton despised, a frontal attack against concrete. Within weeks, the attempt was abandoned. Yet Fort Driant taught Patton a crucial lesson, one his critics often overlook. Metz would not fall by infantry heroics or symbolic assaults. It would fall by isolation, artillery dominance, air power, and timing. Patton adjusted. He waited for November. And when he struck again, it would not be a siege, it would be annihilation.
After the failure at Fort Driant, Patton did something his critics rarely acknowledge. He stopped. October 1944 became a month of preparation, not spectacle. The Third Army stockpiled artillery ammunition on a massive scale. Engineers repaired roads under constant rain. Air planners studied every fort, every gun embrasure, every supply route feeding Metz. Patton knew the truth the German commanders inside the fortress also knew. Forts could survive bombardment, but armies could not survive isolation. He ordered crossings planned not at Metz, but around it. Bridges over the Moselle would be forced simultaneously north and south, cutting the fortress off from reinforcement in retreat. The weather turned brutal. Rain, fog, and mud grounded aircraft and slowed movement. To many observers, it looked like stagnation. In reality, Patton was assembling one of the most coordinated assaults the Third Army would ever execute.
On 8 November 1944, Patton struck. Under fog and freezing rain, Third Army units crossed the Moselle River north and south of Metz. German observers, blinded by weather and overwhelmed by artillery, struggled to respond. This time, Patton did not attack the forts, he went around them. Armored divisions surged east, severing roads, rail lines, and communications. German Fourth troops found themselves trapped inside concrete prisons, well-armed, well-built, and suddenly irrelevant. Artillery thundered day and night. Over 3,000 guns fired in coordinated barrages, one of the heaviest concentrations of fire in the European theater. The Germans had planned to defend Metz as a fortress. Patton turned it into a liability. The spine of the defense began to bend.
As the ring closed, something unexpected happened. German forts, designed to dominate battlefields, became isolated islands. Cut off from food, water, and ammunition, many garrisons realized the truth too late. No relief was coming. American artillery targeted exits, ventilation shafts, and supply routes. Airstrikes hit power stations and communications hubs. Infantry waited patiently, refusing costly assaults. One by one, forts surrendered, some without firing another shot. By 19 November 1944, the fortress system that had resisted armies for centuries was collapsing, not through brute force, but through exhaustion. Patton had finally proven his point. Fixed fortifications were not monuments to strength. They were monuments to immobility.
On 22 November 1944, Metz officially fell. Over 50,000 German soldiers were captured. The Moselle line was broken. The road into Germany lay open. Yet the victory arrived quietly. No dramatic charge, no single decisive battle. Just methodical destruction of an idea the German army had trusted for generations. Even Patton's critics were forced to concede the result. But the final judgment did not come from Eisenhower. It came from London. When news of Metz reached Winston Churchill, the man who had once praised fortresses as shields of empire offered a remark that cut through centuries of military tradition. What Churchill said next would redefine how history remembered Metz and Patton himself.
When news of Metz reached London in late November 1944, Winston Churchill did not celebrate loudly. He reflected. According to multiple Allied accounts, Churchill remarked that the fall of Metz was a vindication of maneuver warfare over the tyranny of stone. It was not a flourish, it was an admission. For decades, European military thinking had treated fortresses as anchors of strategy. Metz was supposed to delay armies, drain momentum, and protect the Reich's western approaches. Patton had destroyed that assumption. Churchill understood the implication immediately. If Metz could fall, not by storming its walls, but by rendering them irrelevant, then no fixed defense in Germany was safe. Not the West Wall, not the Rhine crossings, not even the cities themselves. Metz was not just a battlefield victory. It was a conceptual defeat for German strategy.
Yet Metz remains controversial. Critics argue Patton paid too high a price, months of delay, heavy casualties, and resources that might have fueled a rapid dash to the Rhine. They point to the Hurtgen Forest, fought simultaneously as another example of grinding attrition the Allies struggled to justify. Supporters counter with cold logistics. An armed fortress on the flank threatens supply lines. Artillery does not need to advance to kill, it only needs range. Metz commanded river crossings, roads, and rail hubs vital to any eastward push. Patton's gamble was not about glory, it was about certainty. By eliminating Metz, he removed a variable that could not be ignored once the advance into Germany began. That decision would shape everything that followed in 1945.
Some viewers draw comparisons to the Pacific War. Admiral Chester Nimitz bypassed heavily fortified islands, leaving Japanese garrisons isolated and irrelevant. Why not do the same at Metz? The answer lies in geography. In the Pacific, bypassed islands sat in oceans. At Metz, bypassed fortresses sat astride roads, rivers, and supply arteries feeding entire armies. A single German counterattack from Metz could have severed Patton's fuel lines during the push toward the Saar and Rhine. Unlike isolated islands, Metz was connected to the heart of Europe. Patton understood this distinction. He did not reject maneuver warfare, he refined it for the continent. Metz was not crushed by obsession, but by controlled inevitability.
With Metz secured, the Third Army surged forward. Within weeks, Patton's forces crossed into Germany, shattered the Saar defenses, and later raced north to relieve Bastogne during the Ardennes crisis. None of that would have been possible with a hostile fortress threatening his rear. Metz did not make headlines like Bastogne. It did not inspire speeches like Normandy, but it removed an obstacle older than modern warfare itself. That is why Churchill's remark mattered. Metz proved that wars were no longer won by walls, but by movement, coordination, and logistics. Patton had not simply taken a city. He had closed the book on fortress warfare in Western Europe.
Victory at Metz came with a price. Between September and November 1944, the U.S. Third Army suffered thousands of casualties, killed, wounded, and missing, many during the early fighting around Fort Driant and the Moselle crossings. Critics point to these numbers as proof that Metz was unnecessary. But casualty analysis reveals something less comfortable. The majority of losses occurred before Patton shifted strategy, before isolation replaced assault. Once the fortress was cut off, German resistance collapsed rapidly. This distinction matters. Metz did not bleed the Third Army because Patton insisted on breaking it. It bled because modern armies were still learning how to fortresses built for a different age. By November, Patton had learned faster than his enemy.
Dwight D. Eisenhower never publicly celebrated Metz. That silence has fueled decades of speculation. As Supreme Allied Commander, Eisenhower had balanced political pressure, coalition unity, and logistics on a continental scale. He had diverted fuel north. He had restrained Patton more than once. Metz complicated that narrative. The victory suggested Patton's instincts, often dismissed as reckless, had been strategically sound under the right conditions. Eisenhower did not contradict that assessment. He simply moved on. In coalition warfare, silence can be agreement. Metz was allowed to stand on its results alone. No medals, no speeches. Just a cleared flank and an open road into Germany.
Inside Metz, the German experience was bleak. Many fortress troops were older reservists, Volksgrenadiers, or units reassigned from quieter sectors. Supplies dwindled, communication failed, orders from Berlin became irrelevant. Hitler demanded the fortress be held at all costs. But fortresses do not fight. Men do. As isolation tightened, German commanders faced a choice: obey orders and die underground, or surrender and preserve their troops. Most chose survival. By the end, Metz was not taken.
It was abandoned by a strategy that no longer matched reality.
Metz marked an ending. Not the end of fortified defenses, but the end of believing they could decide wars alone. After 1944, military doctrine changed. Mobility, logistics, air superiority, and coordination replaced concrete as the currency of victory. Patton did not destroy Metz with tanks or infantry. He destroyed it with relevance. That is why Churchill's remark still echoes. Metz fell because the world had changed, and the fortress had not. The lesson was learned quietly, paid for dearly, and rarely celebrated. But it shaped how modern wars would be fought.
After Metz, Patton did not pause to reflect. The Third Army moved east, crossed into Germany, and within weeks would be racing north to meet the crisis in the Ardennes. Bastogne would define Patton's public legacy, but Metz shaped his military one. Among Allied planners, Metz quietly reinforced a reality they preferred not to advertise. Patton, for all his flaws, understood operational warfare at a level few could match. He had not won by recklessness, he had won by adaptation. Metz was the battle where Patton stopped being a cavalryman chasing momentum and became a commander willing to wait, prepare, and close the trap.
Metz never fit the mythology of World War II. There was no single heroic moment, no airborne landing, no dramatic counterattack, just weeks of planning, weather delays, artillery coordination, and surrender. History prefers spectacle. Normandy had beaches, Bastogne had encirclement, Metz had logistics. As a result, it faded from popular memory, despite being one of the most technically demanding operations conducted by the U.S. Army in Europe. Its legacy survived not in speeches, but in staff colleges and doctrine manuals. That may be its greatest proof of importance.
Was Metz a mistake? Historians still argue the question. Some say the months lost could have shortened the war. Others insist the fortress had to be neutralized before any safe advance into Germany. What Metz ultimately proves is this: war rarely offers perfect choices, only acceptable risks. Patton chose certainty over speed, and when the winter crisis arrived in December 1944, with German forces surging through the Ardennes, that certainty mattered. The Third Army moved without fear of its rear. Metz had already done its work.
Winston Churchill's remark about Metz was never meant as praise for Patton alone. It was an acknowledgment that an era had ended. Fortresses, walls, and fixed defenses had dominated European warfare for centuries. Metz was their last great test, and their last great failure. Churchill understood history as well as war. Metz did not fall because Patton was reckless. It fell because the world had changed, and Patton recognized it sooner than most. That is what made the victory significant.
Metz was never meant to be legendary. It was meant to be decisive. When the fortress fell, no speeches followed, no monuments were raised. The war simply moved on, toward the Rhine, toward Berlin, toward its end. But buried beneath the city's stone and concrete lies a verdict history eventually delivered. Metz was not impregnable. It was obsolete. And the man who proved it did not shout the lesson. He applied it. That is why, decades later, Metz still matters.